Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Tom Hastings, and I am an educator at Cheehaw Park and Zoo, Flint River Aquarium, and Thranatiska Heritage Center. And today I have a really cool topic for everybody. I find this one very interesting, and we're going to talk about convergent evolution. And so what this means and what convergent evolution is it's when different organisms that may not even be closely related evolve similar traits or characteristics. And they do this for a number of different reasons. And so we are going to talk a little bit more in depth about evolution and why change occurs, what can lead to convergent evolution, and then we're going to go over some examples and make some comparisons between animals and see some traits that they have in common. So it's a very cool topic. I hope you all enjoy it. And so first, I just want to start off by talking about what convergent evolution is and why it happens over time. So again, it's when two organisms that are not closely related evolve similar traits or characteristics. And this can happen for a number of different reasons. So animals change over time and they are continuously changing and adapting to their environment. And so many different things can cause an animal to change. So one example of this is if the environment changes, animals have to adapt to their environments. So we can think about things like climate change. In response to climate change, animals really have two options. They can either adapt to their changing environments or they can move and they can migrate and remain within suitable habitat conditions that they're already adapted for. So that's one example of change over time that animals are going to have to respond to one way or the other. Another example of things that animals have to respond to and change with over time is the presence or absence of new species. So if a new species is introduced to an area, animals are going to have to respond to that new animal within their environment. And so different interactions can occur when new animals are introduced into an area. And this can be things like maybe this animal is going to be a predator to other animals now that are found in that location. So oftentimes things like invasive species that get introduced into an area are now a problem for animals. So animals have to find a way to deal with this new problem or this new animal that's going to be a predator for them. And so what's going to happen is these animals are going to adapt and they're going to try to evolve traits or characteristics that allow them to defend themselves, maybe characteristics that will allow them to avoid that animal or to even be able to escape. So there can be lots of different things. So when we think about avoiding, we can think about color patterns and trying to blend in with your environment, characteristics that allow you to escape predators, so having hind limbs that allow you to jump really fast or far, or even there's a lot of different ways in which animals can adapt and change over time. And so, and that can lead to characteristics. Maybe a new animal comes into your range that can now be a prey source for you, and you need to change so you can be more efficient at catching that prey item, or maybe a prey item that was already present disappeared for some reason. So now you have to rely, or animals have to rely on new food sources. And so they need to change so that they can capture those new food sources. So in general, evolution is this idea that animals that have certain characteristics or traits within an environment that allow them to survive and be most competitive is going to be favored by evolution. And so when evolution favors certain traits or characteristics of animals, that means it's a good trait or characteristic. Those animals are doing well. And so evolution is going to favor those animals and they are going to be more likely to survive into the future. And so with that, animals will have traits and characteristics. And now we're going to look specifically at different animals that have this same trait or characteristics, but that evolved completely independently. So it's just a really cool way to look at how different animals may have come up with the same strategy in different areas, or maybe even within the same area, but they still developed it independently. And so we're going to look at really cool examples of that. And so to do this, I'm going to share my screen so that hopefully we can get a better understanding of this. and see some really cool examples. So give me 1 second while I share my screen. All right. So the first is, and this one doesn't seem too far-fetched, right? Because these are both animals that we all know are found in aquatic environments like the ocean. And so what you can see that we have here is a shark and a dolphin. So right off the bat, you can see some very similar characteristics between these two animals. And one of them that jumps out at me is their fins. So they both have dorsal fins, they both have pectoral fins and tail fins. And so these fins were independently evolved in these two different animals because, right, one is a mammal, our dolphin is a mammal, and our shark is a fish. So they're not too closely related. And so that means that they had to evolve these characteristics independently. But they did it because they want to meet very similar needs. And so, right, the need that they needed to meet was to be able to efficiently swim in aquatic environments. So they both evolved fins that make them really good at swimming in these aquatic environments. And so they need to be good at swimming in oceans so that they can catch food, so that they can be more efficient at moving and not wasting as much energy. Some animals may need to get away from predators, but nonetheless, they needed to be good at swimming in these environments for their everyday lives. And so that's why they both evolved these fins. Now, there's something else that both these animals have in common that sticks out to me. Does anybody else see what these two animals have in common, even though one's a mammal and one's a fish? They both have a pretty streamlined body. And so when they're swimming through the water, they don't want to have all these extra, appendages sticking out or to be wide. They want to be able to move through the water easily and efficiently. So that's why they have these body shapes that are very similar, and that goes hand in hand with their fins, right? They want to maximize how good they are at swimming in the water. And because of that, evolution has favored these animals that have come up with these very similar characteristics. They're not identical, so you can see some differences between like the pectoral fins here, but overall, these traits are similar. And so this is an example of two different animals that have evolved similar characteristics. And just to provide some examples of how they're different, because they are different animals, right? What's one difference between a shark and a dolphin? Somebody know? You can see it on the shark. Sharks have gills, so they can breathe in the water, whereas our dolphin is still a mammal, and so it still needs rest to respire through the air. So that's why you oftentimes see dolphins doing what this dolphin is doing here in this picture, or not even maybe as drastic as that of actually jumping out of the water, but just peeking out of the water so that they can get air. So they always have to come up for air. That's how they breathe still, just like we do. And so that's one big difference between those animals that shows that they are still quite different from each other. All right, so that's a cool example, and it's a little bit easy to follow because we know they're both found in the water. But this next one is going to be a little bit more extreme in their differences. And so what I have here is a bat and a beluga whale. And so does anybody have any ideas what trait or characteristic both of these animals that are very different may have evolved over time? Does anybody have any ideas? Well, so they both evolved what's called echolocation. And so echolocation is this idea that sound waves can be emitted from an animal and bounced off of objects and reflected back towards the animal as a way to understand what is in their surroundings. So bats have evolved this echolocation so that they can see their food in their environment. And so really what they're doing is they have these chirps, these high frequency chirps and sound waves that they put out. And what it does is it will hit objects and reflect back. And they have become very good at this. And so I have the picture of the moth up here because one of the main prey items, or I should say a common prey item for bats is moths. So one other reason that evolution may favor certain animals is if they are able to fill a role or a niche in an ecosystem that's not yet filled. And so if you think about it, not only do a lot of animals fly, but there's not a lot of animals that fly at night or that are really good at being active at night. So bats are nocturnal. That's why in this picture it looks like it's all black behind the bat. And so these bats have evolved and adapted to come out at night when there's this whole source of food that's untapped. So we know lots of insects are also nocturnal and will start coming out at night or when the sun sets. A common example of this that we probably all have experienced is once it starts getting dark out, we start getting bit by mosquitoes because they're coming out at night. And so we know there's lots of insects that start coming out at night. And so that's a whole source of food that's not really being utilized. So bats have evolved so that they can be successful in coming out and feeding at night. And they do this using that echolocation. So because it's dark out and they can't see as great, they can use this echolocation to get exact locations of objects. So they can determine the texture of animals based off of these high frequencies that reflect back to them, which is very impressive. They can determine the distance, the angle at which the animal is compared to them. And what they'll do is they get closer, they'll send out more of these chirps or these high frequency waves. And the more they put out and the closer they get, they can home in to animals. And that's what allows them to find food in these nighttime environments. But I also mentioned earlier that evolution is this idea that animals consistently change over time in response to other animals. So these moths have also now have a problem, right? They have a bat that's figured out, that's evolved to come out at night when these insects come out and is now good at eating them. So now the moths have to respond to this. They can't just continuously get eaten without having any way of defending themselves, or else they would probably just go extinct, right? Or not go, or maybe locally go extinct. And so now moths have to figure out a way to protect themselves. So these moths have evolved to have sensory systems that alert them when they get hit by an echolocation wave by a bat. So they are able to recognize, uh-oh, we were just recognized, a bat is homing in on us. And so what they'll do is they'll behaviorally try to throw the bat off. And so this is a defense mechanism of them. They are going to behaviorally try to defend themselves. So what they'll do is they'll either tuck their wings in and dive really fast to try to get away from a bat that's homing in on them, or they'll fly in circles to try to disorient the bat. It's going to be a lot more difficult for a bat to home in with echolocation if the prey object is continuously moving. And they also try to kind of absorb or deflect the echolocation waves in different locations to also kind of throw the bat off its path. And so one thing that's really cool that when I was in school and I learned about that I found was really interesting is this concept of an evolutionary arms race, kind of. And so it's this idea that once an animal realizes that they have a predator that's specialized in homing in on them, they need to do what these moths have done and try to figure out ways to defend themselves against the bats. So they've come up with these sensory systems now that alert them. And so they may be a little bit better at getting away, but then bats are now going to try to evolve to become more efficient. So it's really kind of a race between two different animals, or maybe several different animals, in trying to increase survival or predatory abilities. And so animals can constant balance of trying to change so that they can survive is kind of what determines to which animals may eventually survive and be selected for by evolution, or which may not be as successful and may eventually, as a result, be lost in an area. So really cool to show that. But going back, beluga whales, the original thing that I was supposed to be talking about here, I got a little off track, is convergent evolution. So bats have echolocation. They evolved it to find food essentially at night where there's this huge food source. Now they're filling a role in their environment by coming out at night. But beluga whales also use echolocation. So you can see on the head, they have what's called their melon here, and they can emit those frequency waves from their melon. And the same kind of concept happens in that it bounces off of objects, it reflects back towards the beluga whales. They will collect those waves, those reflected waves back in their lower jaw, and then process it in an internal central ear. And so it's very impressive. It's very similar to the bats. They can determine, where shore is, how far shore is. They can get an understanding of what objects may be on the surface below them, where other animals are within the environment surrounding them. They can also use it to help find prey and to be better at feeding. So beluga whales, I actually worked in a location where beluga whales were up in the subarctic, and they will come into some rivers during the summer, and they'll do a lot of feeding. And so with waters like that, it can be a little bit difficult to find prey. So having this echolocation can be really helpful. And also just in general with other whales, so they're not the only ones, other animals like the whale can do this in the water. The deeper you get, the less sunlight that's going to be available, and the less sunlight that's available in the water, it may not always be this clear like in this picture. And so visibility may not be great in the water either. So having a way to navigate your aquatic environment where it's not as easy to see, echolocation can be really helpful there as well. So both of these animals have independently evolved this characteristic of echolocation for very similar needs, which is navigating environments that can be difficult to see in and finding food and tapping into a food source that may not be getting used by a lot of other animals. So really cool example. I think it's really interesting. But we're also going to use the bat for another example. So does anybody have any idea as to what this bat has that is a trait that is shared by other animals that also evolved this trait? All right, so bats have wings, and wings have been independently evolved in other animals as well, such as insects and birds. And so while some of these animals may have really distant common ancestors, none of the common ancestors had wings or were able to fly. So that means that these animals all did independently evolve these wings. Now, what they did get from their shared common ancestors is the structure which makes their wings. So the bones in their wings was shared, not with the insect, but with the bat and the bird was shared. But the way in which they actually changed the structure of those bones is what makes them independently evolved. And you can tell even the wings themselves are different. So bats have membrane that is stretched out over those bones, whereas birds have feathers. And then I'm going to show you one other difference. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second because this part's very interesting. And that's that, like I said, they changed the bone structure as they independently evolved these wings. So the bat, with the glare, you can tell that they still retained their digits, their 5 digits from their mammalian ancestors. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and then right up here is a tiny 5th digit. And so you can see those digits were retained. I'm trying to give you a good view without the glare. Whereas a bird actually fused those digits together, and they fused it into one structure. And that's really important for birds because they're a lot heavier than bats, so they need to be able to support more weight during flight. And so having that fused bone structure increases their support and their strength that they need in those wings. And so I don't have a skeleton to show. I wish I did, but you can see it a little bit here, how it's kind of fused. And so it's going to fuse and it's going to run down the edge here of this wing. And so we don't see, right, like in the bat, those different digits breaking off into the wing. It's all fused into one structure. So that's a really cool example of how they independently evolved, but how they came up with wing shapes still. So if you look, when I go back, we'll look at the picture of the wing, even though the bone structure is different, they've still come up with a very similar shape. And that's because both animals needed to come up with a type of wing that supports flight. So in both examples, they had a need for flight, and evolution supported flight for both of these organisms. And so that's going to be really important. Now, there's still some differences, right? So birds have flight feathers, these really long feathers towards the end, and some secondary feathers up here. So we have our primary flight feathers and then our secondary feathers closer to the wing itself. And those are important for giving the animal thrust and lift, which are two really important components of flight. But nonetheless, you can see overall the shape of the wings is very similar, and so flight was supported in both of these animals. In fact, in all three of these groups of animals, the insect as well. And so that's a really cool example of how convergent evolution supported flight in all three of these animals. Now, the reason in which the wings were evolved may differ a little bit. So the overarching theme is that all of these animals wanted to fly, and so that's the big one. But the reason why they may wanted to fly is a little bit different. So bats, again, remember, wanted to tap into a food source and utilize a food source of abundant prey at night, which may not be getting consumed by as many other animals. Whereas birds may have evolved wings a little bit more for finding food during the day or being able to hunt, such as this owl, or even just be able to get away from predators. So flight may have been adapted a little bit more in terms of wanting to get away from predators in birds and in insects. So the reasons why they may have wanted to evolve flight may differ a little bit, but regardless, they all still came up with this this trait or this characteristic that's shared among all of them, which is super interesting. And then one other thing that's really cool, this is more of a fun fact, but bats can actually use their wings independently. They can kind of control them separately, which gives them a lot more agility than birds, whereas they work more in unison. And so bats can turn up to 10 times faster. They can navigate a little bit better. They're more agile in the air. And that might be why we see them able to like switch up and dart around a lot when they're trying to catch food at night. And again, this could be important because if insects are trying to evade them at night, it may be important for them to be able to try to keep up with insects that are trying to get away and be able to make sharp turns when they're echolocating on the fly, to be able to catch prey a little bit better. Whereas if birds are using it a little bit more, maybe to avoid predators, their primary focus is going to be just getting away as fast as possible and not necessarily changing or direction quite as frequently or as fast. So that's pretty cool to think about. But there's also a third organism or group that also evolved wings, and is another example of an animal that has convergent evolution with these, but is now extinct, and that's the pterosaur. And so this animal, like I said, is extinct now, but you can see, again, very similar wing shape. And you can also tell they have the 5 digits, but I mentioned that the structure differed, which meant that they were evolved independently, right? So even though the bird and this extinct animal or organism shared a common ancestor in the distant past, that shared common ancestor also could not fly or did not have wings, and so that further supports this idea that it was evolved independently. And again, the bone structure is a little bit different. So, right, the birds have the fused structure, whereas This organism, if you look over here on the left, it shows it pretty well. You can see that there, some of the digits are found up top, and 4 out of the 5 are used kind of as claws, whereas the 4th digit is what's elongated and what gives the structure for the wing. So it's a little bit similar to the bird in that there's only one that elongates out, but they did retain the other ones that they use as claws, which birds do not have. So you can see some structural difference there again as well. So I thought this was a really cool example. And then we don't necessarily just have to think about animals that are evolving similar traits and characteristics to meet similar needs, such as flight. Plants can do it as well. So these both look like the same kind of plant, which we would think is a cactus, right? But actually only the plant on the right here is a cactus. The one over here on the left is a euphorbia. And sometimes a lot of plants that are similar to this are things like succulents. And so even though these are found in different locations and they're different plant types, they have evolved very similar strategies. And they had to do this because they're found in similar environments. So they had to kind of adapt to life in very similar environments. And so they evolved very similar traits. And that environment is dry, hot desert environments. And so what they've done is they've evolved to have their stems, which is what we're seeing here, be the primary portion of their body that's above ground. And that's because these kind of thick, sturdy stems are what retain moisture really well, rather than having leaves exposed to like other plants in the background. And so having those watertight stems and that are their photosynthetic parts is really important for maintaining water in these really dry, hot environments. And what else you might think is similar is cactuses have spines, they have those needles, right? But in a cactus, those needles are actually modified leaves. Those are their leaves that are specialized to be sharp. And while you can see those dark layers of spines or needles on this euphorbia on the left, those actually aren't modified leaves. Those are just developed spines, and so they're not the same. But again, it's a characteristic that is serving the same role. So when these plants are found in these dry, hot environments, lots of animals are going to want to eat them because they can be a good source of food and water in these really resource limited environments. And so having those protective structures like spines is important to both. But I just want to provide an example of plants that can also adapt to their environments very similarly, but doing so independently. And then there's lots of other ways in which similarities can form over time. It doesn't necessarily just have to be organisms that have very distant shared common ancestors or who happen to evolve the same characteristics or traits to meet needs within their environment. It can also arise due to things like mimicry. So mimicry is this idea that after a model organism or the organism that initially evolved a characteristic or a trait, it's going to get replicated by another organism. So on the right here, we have this eastern coral snake. This is a very venomous snake, and so they are very dangerous, and they have this color pattern. You can see the yellow and the red, those bright colors, that says to other organisms, hey, I'm dangerous, you don't want to mess with me, I can hurt you. And so we call this aposematic coloration, which is essentially just a warning color. And animals learn this color pattern and they realize that this snake is dangerous after learning so, and over time they will start to avoid this animal. But what happened is this king snake then realized that this snake was protected based on its color patterns and other animals learning that it's dangerous. So it tried to mimic, and it did mimic, the color patterns of this other dangerous animal. And because it mimicked the color patterns well enough, it may confuse predators, and predators may mistake this snake for the actual dangerous one. And so predators are going to avoid this other snake too, even though it's actually not dangerous. It's just mimicking the color pattern of a dangerous snake. And so essentially, predators such as birds aren't going to take their chance and try to attack this snake in case it is one of the dangerous ones. And so we call this Batesian mimicry. And so it's this idea that a non-dangerous animal is mimicking a model organism that is dangerous and benefiting from that mimicry. So really the eastern coral snake isn't benefiting from this, just the animal that's mimicking it is. But there's another type of mimicry in which both animals benefit. And so an example of this is the monarch butterfly and the viceroy butterfly. And so what this monarch butterfly does is it eats milkweed, which has some chemicals in it that is really harmful to predators such as birds. And so if a bird is to eat this monarch butterfly, it's going to taste terrible to the bird and it's going to make the bird ill and sick. And so birds are not going to want to eat this monarch butterfly anymore because they know they're going to get sick and potentially become unhealthy if they eat this monarch butterfly. So the viceroy butterfly on the left, which looks very similar to the monarch butterfly, kind of mimicked its color pattern. But what's different is that this viceroy butterfly also now eats milkweed. And so what's going to happen is both animals are going to benefit from looking like each other because animals are going to learn twice as fast whether they're eating the monarch or the viceroy butterfly that eating anything that looks like this is going to result in illness or sickness. So if only one animal looks like this and is getting animals sick and this animal is just benefiting, then it's going to take a little bit lower for that behavior to be learned. Whereas if they both look similar and they both will make animals sick, then predators are going to learn twice as fast and be reminded often that they should avoid animals that look like this. And so both animals are going to benefit from looking like each other. So, and coming back to convergent evolution, there are two different organisms that have very similar characteristics or traits, which is their appearance and their color patterns, right? Which is the same with the two snakes on the previous slide. So it's another cool example of how evolution can have different organisms evolving to have similar characteristics. And again, in this case, that's color patterns. So very cool example. And I think that is all I have for you. And so I hope you all enjoyed this and learned something. It's a very cool topic about how animals are going to change over time and evolve characteristics and traits that may be very similar to other animals to be selected by evolution to survive and persist over time and change with their environment and other changes surrounding them. So I hope you all enjoyed this and have a great rest of your day and take care, everybody.